happy that we're going to have a great conversation today, and also to the participants who are out there joining us. I hope you will join in on the conversation. I thought what it might be good to do is just to start by giving a bit of background for why you see that Vancouver map that you just saw with those almost no freeways, certainly no freeways in the core city. And what are some of the implications of that for the kind of city that we have designed and built, the personality and the character of the city? And then after those opening comments, which I thought might take about 15 or 20 minutes, that we would open it to a chat, a conversation. So you can really start by asking the first, there we go. Asking the first question, why are there no freeways in Vancouver? And there are two fundamental reasons for that. The first has to do with our setting. Vancouver is just filled, permeated with water bodies. And so to build any kind of transportation system is very, very expensive in the city. And because of that, we were a little behind other North American cities years ago, back in the 50s, in proceeding with our freeway system. We had a design for a freeway system, and we had land purchased for a freeway system, but it was going to be pretty expensive. It was pretty daunting, and that kind of held things up again. And one of the results of that was we could begin to see some of the implications of freeway systems elsewhere. But more importantly, the location that had been conceived for the freeway was going to crash through some very important historic neighborhoods. And that caused the election of a reformed city council, very progressive city council. And one of the most fundamental things they did, they changed many aspects of Vancouver. One of the most fundamental things they did was to declare in no uncertain terms that there would be no freeways coming into the city. And they sold the land that had been put together for freeways. They got rid of the plans, and they basically said no freeways. And we'll have to figure out how to build a city without that. And you can imagine at the time that was a pretty courageous thing. Cities thought they were going to die if they didn't have freeways. What it caused was two things. One was a reaction at the regional or metropolitan level to develop a new kind of metropolitan plan that had basically a series of town centers that would be connected ultimately by transit, and to cause and foster a much more proactive plan for the inner city. Because as you can see from this image, the fact is that Vancouver is a very centrist kind of city. Here's another image of that just shows how the core city does sit in very high profile as compared to the rest of the region. So that really set off the kind of cities development that we now see in Vancouver, which has often been called Vancouverism. In more recent history, we've continued to question the automobile infrastructure. Just last year, for example, the only two components of the automobile, the freeway that did get built very early, which were two viaducts over an industrial area, the council decided to get rid of those, and over the next year and a half to 2 years, I think we'll start that. But even closer in, if you look at some of our bridges, we've started to remove some of the ramps that get onto those bridges, because the fact is that the city's urban land is very valuable, and literally acres and acres and acres of land, or hectares and hectares of land, are taken up by very, one thing, which is just moving cars around more quickly. So you could ask the first question, of course, which is, sorry, I just got us out there. I guess I should move that. How do people move around in the city? Well, once you no longer defer completely to the car, then, and it's not really preeminent, then you start to really get interested in movement choices. Now, it's important to say that we're not demonizing the car. This is not an anti-car scenario. Our attitude is that there is a place for the automobile. Certain kinds of trips are best used by the automobile. We understand the consumer just loves personal mobility, private mobility in this way. But we are putting the car within the context of a range of alternatives. We've been investing mostly in the last 25 years in transit, rapid transit, but also buses and all kinds of transit. But mostly it has been about alternative modes, and particularly it has been about people walking. So the single most important idea that has emerged once the freeway was out of the equation, and the whole attitude that came with that, which is that the car dominated over everything else, was that we established this idea of proximity, that really the most important way you can handle movement is to have less trips and fewer trips. And the way you do that is to get the things that people want to go to and be at closer together. And that allows people to then forego the long commuter trip. Now, I'm not saying that people do not have that commuter trip, or all Vancouverites don't have that commuter trip, but fewer and fewer have that than you would have expected with the freeway-oriented city. Now, you might ask the next question, which is, how does traffic move? If you don't have a freeway, how do people get in and out of the city? It is still quite a centrist city. The fact, what we learned was that the big mistake moving from the 50s forward was the thought that you should focus traffic into a few access routes, and that ultimately creates the demand for the freeway. Instead, we are dispersing traffic over a variety of routes. So there are many ways in and out of the city. They are normalized boulevards, normalized streets. There's a very careful hierarchy of streets. Some streets are expected to carry more of that traffic, some less. And really, we try to use the entire network to move automobiles around. And I have to tell you, I'm not going to say it's not true. We do have congestion. Congestion becomes a part of the equation. And I think what happens over time, has happened with us over time, is that there's a little more tolerance for congestion here than you might find in other cities, where people just expect to hop on a freeway and get somewhere. Although we also know that's often not the case. There's just as much congestion on those freeways during busy times. But people do accept some congestion. So you might say to yourself, well then, and here's a good example of one of our typical major boulevards. It's also carrying other modes, but you can see that there is congestion there. You might say, well, what's the result in the city, in terms of the form of the city, when you don't have freeways? Well, there is a natural inclination, which is works very much in your favor, a natural inclination among consumers to think about what they could do more intelligently, more helpfully for themselves, if they can forego that commuter trip, which is, it's a little bit more complicated in our system when going through the normal street system. It's not as dependable, admittedly. We like to say congestion, that very congestion is our friend, because it really causes people, has very naturally caused people to say, well, what could I do differently in my own life? And what the biggest thing that tens of thousands of households have decided is, why don't we just move closer to where we work, or where we go to school, or where the major attractions of our lives have been. And that has had two important manifestations. One is in the inner city, because we are so centrist as in terms of workplaces, it caused us to develop something we called our living first strategy downtown, where we said that as much as there should be offices and workplaces in downtown, there should be places to live, there should be a balance there. And to do that, of course, immediately density has to come into the equation. We say density is our friend, or can be our friend, if we play our cards right. At the same time, throughout the rest of the region, there also has been an inclination to develop these more diversified regional town centers. And over the years, although it's been a little slower, they have come along as important focal points throughout the metropolitan area, increasingly now connected together by transit, so that people both can cluster close to these for the day-to-day experience of their lives, and they can also get around the region if they need to by transit. There's also been a third thing that's very important, and that is a kind of a gentle densification around the lower density areas of the city as well. We, for example, I think overall are quite twice as dense as Seattle, nearby at similar scale and type of city. We are twice as dense, and how that manifests itself is that there's very few areas where there are truly single-family dwellings. Mostly there are secondary suites. There are now increasingly backyard housing and other forms of very gentle densification. So you might then you would ask, what is the character of the city that has resulted from all of that activity, that different kind of thinking, but also from that absence of freeways? And the first thing I would say is that we've seen the emergence of the neighborhood as just a profound organizing feature of the city, not just the reemergence of the historic neighborhoods, but also the new neighborhoods as we've been building them with a balance of workplaces, housing, recreation, attractions, and we've seen massive, massive growth in the inner city. We went from 37,000 people to 115,000 people in about 18 years. That's continuing to grow. We have about 10,000 children downtown, which is greater than even the surrounding historic older streetcar neighborhoods, any one of them now. The child population is really exploding downtown. We have less auto ownership per household than we had before. Every year there's a little bit less ownership of cars because people just don't seem to need them as much. We have less cars coming in and out of the downtown. It's been going down at about 1.25% a year over the last 20 years. And now 60% of the trips of downtown are done by non-motorized modes. And that's obviously mostly people walking. By the way, statistically, we are also the healthiest city in Canada, at least. And I think part of that, Dr. Larry Frank suggests that part of that is because of this way of building the city. And also we have very energized street life. All of our streets are alive most of the time. And that's because people are using the streets to walk from the places that they need to walk to. So you got to start though when you see that and you see the result, you have to ask yourself, how did we secure that character for the city? Because it's true, and it's as true here as it would be anywhere in North America, that most people hate density. They hate it because it's been so poorly done. Well, for us, we had to make urban design the central tenet of everything that we did, and the choreography of design, not just within buildings, but among buildings and at the whole neighborhood level. We've always said that design really is our friend. It's another one of the things that we've emphasized more than other cities. We have a pretty strong regulatory framework for design, or I should say there's a codification, although it's a very flexible framework. That starts at the neighborhood level with the structure of those neighborhoods have very explicitly been designed as complete neighborhoods. It's not happening by accident. They include the amenity infrastructure that are needed by people. There's an aggressive social mix agenda of both family housing and low-income or non-market housing, social housing as we call it in Canada. Most importantly though, the nature, the personality of the place has been really changed. We've tried to domesticate the inner city, domesticate the streetscape. We have the shop house, of course, along our major retail routes, but frankly, there's not enough demand at the regional and larger level for this to be a solution for the street level at all streets. So we now have thousands of townhouses. that have come in, and a real emphasis on streetscapes and all aspects of the design of streetscapes, and very much so on landscape as an important feature to humanize the environment that we've created at high density. So that's down at the street. Up at higher levels, we have tall, thin towers. We separate our towers, as you see in this image, and for views, we broker private views, we protect public views, and then all of this density is put within a very strong network of open space and parks. We've added about 65 acres of parks in the city, in the core city, over the last 20 years or so. So that's the basic story, John and Alex. I want to show you, just before I open the discussion, just a few more of the images of the kind of city that results. And these are not unusual images. These are literally images you could walk out to the street and take at almost any day. They're showing the kind of ambience of the city that results. They're showing what's really mostly in your consciousness when you experience the city. The density comes with the roof, green roofs. It comes with the open space format. It comes with these strong podiums, these townhouse podiums. Here's an example. The towers are kind of backed and behind those podiums. And I wanted to show quite a few of these examples so you can see the personality. By the way, this is all very contemporary architecture. And the density kind of disappears as a result of that. More recently in our Athletes Village, as you see here, we've been experimenting a big time with the mid-rise as well, these being some examples, and trying to narrow our streets. These little local streets now are very, very narrow streets. That's on purpose. Surrounding our open space with buildings and really enjoying the mixed-use building. Of course, we take advantage of our water for mobility, as well as all the other benefits. As you see here, we try to use our roofs for not just decorative gardens, but for food as well. Just generally trying to build a city that would be enticing to people to come and live in, and really make that the alternative to the private car. And I think, and that commuter trip from the suburbs, I think the idea back in the 50s was that you build those freeways and it would really energize the city, bringing people in. The fact was that it ended up draining the city. And so now I think anything that we can do to moderate that and then redesign the city is in the right direction. And that's really the overall message of Vancouver and Vancouverism. So John, I think we should open it for a chat at this point.
Okay, so Larry, John Norquist here,
Yes.
and I have a question. Vancouver didn't bite into the freeway apple back in the 50s and 60s. If it had been an American city, it would have had the 90% funded interstate program, 10% state funded, 0% local funded. But in Canada, you don't have really much of a national highway program, or transit program for that matter. So is that subsidiarity, the fact that the national government's not involved, did that help you avoid having freeways? Gotta open it for him. Sorry about the technical.
Okay,
you're on.
Yeah. I think that's a big issue. We are a confederation as a country, and that means that a lot of the power rests with the provinces, and that has over the years caused a lot of power to be vested with cities. For example, we own our streets. They're not under the control of senior governments. But more importantly, we've never really had an urban agenda at the national level at all. In fact, I would say in many respects that's been a liability in the country. But in the case of freeways, it's been a benefit because we didn't have that overlaid on us, or more importantly, all that money dangled in front of us at the local level and saying, do it, do it, do it. And so I think that has been a factor. I'm not sure it's the most important factor, but certainly back then when you realized the romance with freeways, it probably was a
It was an
factor. This
influence,
causes
not a
everything later.
not a total explanation, an influence. Okay, so I have a special treat for you today, Larry. Vancouver doesn't have any freeways, and we'll never really know what it would be like if it had. But I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you. This is Vancouver without freeways, and this is Vancouver with the Alaskan Viaduct from Seattle. So that's
Yeah,
what in here in close up, just in case. There's Vancouver, and there's the freeway.
yeah.
That's
And
what you missed out on.
the frightening truth is that we had those designs and they went right through our historic gas town and they would have wiped out our historic Chinatown. What we would have lost in terms of the cultural richness of the city had that occurred. Not the least of which, John, is just the amount of land that takes. The amount of
Yeah.
land that you think of the value of inner city land, the importance of inner city land, and then take so much of it for this kind of one interest, one movement, and it just makes no sense. I think it was someone quoted to me 25 hectares of land at that interchange in Halifax that they're now thankfully getting rid of. That's a lot of land and a lot of value.
Yeah, and the city will be a lot more interesting and complicated after they remove the freeway, and whatever they build there will add to the culture, the ambiance, the value, the economic value of the city.
Absolutely, there's no question. The other thing about that image that you showed that I find kind of fascinating, and we find it even when dealing with our bridges, is that it neutralizes not just the land for the structures itself, it neutralizes the land all around it. So you find that buildings don't want to be as close to that, and the noise and the pollution and everything, all of that's just removed if you can either avoid the freeways. Now I understand most North American cities haven't done that, but if you can at least look at your system and say, what do we really need, and what could we not have? For example, I was just last week in Oklahoma City, and I saw an
They
extraordinary.
have the lowest walk score of any of the 50 largest cities in America, but they're
There you
working
go.
on fixing it.
But I saw an initiative where they're removing one of their freeway linkages close to the downtown, opening up so much land. And now their big issue is, are they going to replace it with something like it, or are they going to use that for urban purposes? It's a fascinating question for them at this very moment.
Yeah, that they relocated the freeway further out and built a much bigger one further out, and then now the Oklahoma DOT would like to basically replace the old freeway corridor with a freeway that isn't quite a freeway, but they should just
Yeah.
build a street. They should go to Vancouver and measure the streets, the exact dimensions of some of your more beautiful streets, and just put them in Oklahoma City and see how it works.
Well, and the interesting thing is that both ways into that streets system they could build, or that made that beautiful boulevard, are entrances into their inner city, which they're trying to work hard to revitalize. And the other thing is that the freeway already provides a bypass just a few kilometers away, so it's not really needed. And this is what we have to get really modern urban consumers, voters thinking about, is that while these proposals are continuing to come forward, I see them in Dallas, in my work in Dallas, the fact is they are not needed. And we can go back to a simple proposition of Jane Jacobs of 50 years ago, roughly, where she said, if you just don't build it, nothing will happen badly. And in fact, in Toronto, she worked on a system. They said, well, the whole place is going to come apart if we don't build this. They stopped it, and nothing happened.
Yeah, I've
People
noticed
thought
that in Toronto that you have streets like Dundas Street, which are really busy. They're congested. They're hopelessly congested, but they're not just congested with traffic. They're congested with people, customers, real estate value, all the things you find in a city. And this idea that congestion is always bad seems strange to me. I mean, you have it's like cholesterol a little bit. You have good cholesterol and bad, and you have, if you own a store and somebody pulls up and parks in front of your store, walks in and buys something, that's good congestion.
That's good congestion. Or if because of that trip, that commuter trip, which is taking 45 minutes in the morning and the evening, you say to yourself, well, why don't we just go live close to where we work, live downtown? That's good congestion.
Yeah. So everywhere you've gone, Larry, in Vancouver, the city's nice and complicated and interesting. It's right at the spot. It's a place in its history where it completely meets the market. It has one of the most buoyant real estate markets, maybe the most buoyant real estate market in North America. And then you were over in Abu Dhabi working over there, and Abu Dhabi's the most urban of the Arab states. Dubai is like a giant. It's sort of a Joni Mitchell song, "Put up a parking lot." But you made Abu Dhabi into a little bit more of an urban place you can walk. Could you just discuss Abu Dhabi quickly before we're going to open it up to questions from the audience in a minute? Like Bruce Donnelly has a really good question. We'll get to that in a minute. But anyway,
Okay,
Abu
well,
Dhabi.
yeah. Abu Dhabi was an interesting challenge because their whole vision of their city before we arrived was pretty much the traditional one: get the freeways built, get the roads widened, and all of that. We came in a team of people. By the way, I led this, but people from around the world. We founded a planning agency there. We got a lot of wonderful, creative people from all over the world involved, talking to them about alternatives, not denying the automobile, because I can tell you in the developing world, they're not going to deny the automobile, but rather beginning to say, look, there's other aspects of the city that are important. Walkability is important. Open space is important. All kinds of other energies are important. And they've slowly been building that into their consciousness. They had one really important advantage, which I'll tell you about, which the other Middle Eastern cities did not have. And that was that the founder, Sheikh Zayed, believed that by using landscape, it was part of their culture that he could declare ownership. And so all the streets of the great boulevards of Abu Dhabi are lavishly landscaped. So they had before them that tradition which they could look back on. As we've seen throughout modern cities, you can look back into traditions that we've forgotten. And that was one that they had forgotten. And once we tapped into that consciousness, they are being more intelligent about it. They're not stopping the freeway or the automobile infrastructure development as much as I would like, but at least there is this double trajectory.
You could have pointed out that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, that he didn't drive a car.
That's true. That's true.
So let's get to Bruce Donnelly's question. Do you have that one here, Alex? Why don't you read it off?
Sure. So Bruce asks, is there an opportunity for small builders in Vancouver? And if so, in what locations? It sounds as if you have vertical scale problem under control downtown, but can you talk about building 1 to 6 houses or 1 to 3 small apartment buildings or 1 light industrial building?
Yeah, actually, you see quite a diversified development community. The images that I've showed you were on purpose today, the highest density downtown images, trying to make a point about density. But one of the big programs it goes along all of our retail streets out in our neighborhoods, where we are developing the shop house thing up to, say, 4 to 5 stories with the housing and then maybe a level of offices and then the retail at grade. Those are often done in very small increments. We also then have a number of areas where you can insinuate townhouses, smaller projects. In fact, we like smaller projects out in the community setting because it has lower impact on those communities. The idea really noticing that there's still going to be a lot of consumers that do not want that higher density is to build out a diversity of density and offer a diversity of development opportunities at various scales. One of the problems has been that some of the industrial development, where it's more traditional industrial zones, are disconnected from transit at a regional level. And so the regional government's been trying to work to motivate the location of industry a little bit more strategically. But otherwise, I think there is a wide development opportunity. Now, one person that I saw writing also asked about affordability. And we really have to discuss affordability in Vancouver.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because it is a huge issue. It's interesting when you look at European cities where the core cities have been vibrant and valuable for a long, long time, you will find that there are more initiatives going on to secure middle income affordability. What we did in Vancouver, and I'll say it bluntly, is that we looked after low income housing to some degree, to a significant degree, but we didn't look at middle income affordability very much. And so all of a sudden you have a very successful city, which means it's valuable, which means, as you said, John, there's huge demand, and it's sustained demand. Even through the downturn of 2008, it was still strong demand for multiple housing, for inner city housing. But we weren't thinking about affordability, and that's now our biggest issue. So the mayor has a big task force going on affordability, and we have to start looking at some of the mechanisms that you see in real successful world cities. For example, one of the ones that I'm really interested in pursuing here is market-based nonprofit housing, which is a very interesting model where people can get ownership and therefore build up equity as they pay off a mortgage. But when they sell the unit, they don't sell it for profit. They sell at a predetermined rate, which keeps the prices down significantly, but still allows an individual consumer to build their own equity, which means at some point they can move into the regular market. And there need to be more things like that. Co-ops, market-based and also nonprofit co-ops, which were a big theme in Canada 35, 40 years ago and died out. Those have to be brought back. So affordability is an issue in any successful city in the world. And it's an issue where you must have affordable housing strategy to go with the kind of revitalization strategy that I'm showing.
There's at least two parts to that. One is, cross subsidy, which is something that's pretty easy to understand, but sometimes the taxpayers resent it. And then the other thing is the diversity of housing types and the diversity of uses helps keep costs down in some locations. And
That's
so
right.
you can.
One of the biggest examples of that has been the program to legalize and facilitate secondary suites and back lane houses. All of a sudden, you can deliver really good quality, ground-oriented, family-friendly housing at a pretty good rental rate and a pretty good cost, and the profit doesn't go to a developer. It goes to a landowner who just, takes an independent action. In other words, they don't mind if there's a little impact of that on their lives because they're getting the profits, as compared to going into a neighborhood and saying, I'm going to build a 10-story building, someone walks away with the profit, and then the neighbors live with the impacts. That's a different kind of social, cultural, and economic scenario. So those are things that we have to get a lot sharper at here in Vancouver.
I want to pull back for just a second to the what you called your worker house or whatever, where you have the 5 stories of housing above 1 floor of retail.
Yeah.
In the United States, the Federal Federal Housing Administration, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these big housing, in their criteria, they have regulations that really make it hard to do mixed use. So like HUD, the HUD multiple family housing program, which is most of the apartment building that's going on in the US right now, really, really discriminates against low-rise or mid-rise housing. So you get 10% of floor space, or no more than 10% can be non-residential. Well, that gives you a 10-story building for starters. You can't build the typical American Main Street. Is there anything like that in Canada? Does the national government have a housing program that discriminates against mixed use?
The federal government has a program to fund some housing. Most of that is done by provincial governments, however. But I can't think of any program of that kind of limitation. In fact, I think our realization is that every building should be a mixed-use building. Not every building, but most buildings should be mixed-use buildings. And the more mixed use, the better. Going back to what we were talking about before, which is, proximity and cutting the number of trips and the length of those trips. The best trip is the one where you go down two flights of stairs to the work.
Energy efficient. You come down in the morning, walk down. It's a little less energy efficient when you walk up at night.
Yeah. The bigger issue in this form, the mid-rise form along major streets, is the interface with the neighborhoods adjacent. And you have to be very, very thoughtful and careful about how those buildings are built and what kind of interface condition occurs so that you don't deliver problems of privacy and noise and other things to people who thought they were buying into a quiet setting. So that has to be carefully managed. But if you look at a street, you look at the sidewalk level, you want all the energy and noise and carry on in the retail. If a second floor is offices where you don't really care about that, by the time you get to the third, fourth, and fifth floor, maybe sixth floor, probably third and fourth more likely, that can be housing. It's a little bit separated from the noise and the carry-on. It's perfectly good housing, and especially the housing that's oriented away from the street. So it's an absolutely beautiful form of housing, and anyone who's got limitations in funding should just get rid of them, period.
Yeah, and of course you don't have to do it on every street. I always like the example in Boston where you have Commonwealth Avenue has no mixed use. It's all housing, a beautiful boulevard with great walking space in the middle. And then you have what's the next street over? The next street over, I'll think of it in a minute.
That's the retail, yeah.
Retail on the first floor and then beautiful apartments above. And it was Boston that made that decision, not the national government, not the state government, but the city of Boston decided one street is mixed use and the other street, Newbury Street is the one that's mixed use. And they made that decision and it works wonderfully together. And that's what I've always been a little bit, CNU has worked to try to get the federal government to stop discriminating against mixed use. And they have, to some extent, they've softened the restrictions a little bit. We have another question that we wanted to pose to you from Hazel Boris, who heads up a wonderful organization, Placemakers. And why don't you read that one?
So you kind of answered a little bit of this. So one of the recurring questions coming up online is that for people living in the most livable city, often can barely afford to live there. So one of the drawbacks of great walkable places is that they drive prices up. What are some ways that Vancouver is looking to increase workforce housing?
Well, first thing, it might be interesting, Hazel, to know that 60% of households in Vancouver still own their home without a mortgage. Very high proportion. By the way, these are people that bought their homes at $8,000 and $10,000, and they've held their homes for 30 and 40 years. And that's still a huge number of people. I'm only saying that as a teaser because I agree with you wholeheartedly, as I've said before, that the affordability issue is a huge issue. We held the wolf from the door with our low-income strategy. We had a strategy, John, that 20% of our units in the downtown would be held aside for low-income housing, and we're slowly building that housing. I think it's now sitting at about 14%, but it's on its way, I think, ultimately to meet that 20%. And we've had special initiatives for homeless people. We're building something like 1,200 units at the moment for homeless people. But it was that middle-income thing that we just weren't thinking about. And that's my big warning to other cities that are really pursuing a revitalization strategy in their core, particularly based on housing, is that you can't ignore that middle income piece. You have to be constantly thinking about it. And part of that comes through a diversity of unit types, because people can then have a lot of choices. For example, units that are lower down and in the back don't have as much value as the ones up front and at the top with all the views. And townhouses in our city don't tend to be as valuable as apartments and other things like that. But that only goes so far. The other thing you can do is make sure you have a vibrant market delivering housing, because the best thing to moderate prices is good supply and demand balance. But that is not good enough. We have to go further. We have to have specific initiatives, and they have to be, in our case, because of the nature of our country, they have to be led by our government, that really do create some of those models that I was talking about before, John. The market-based nonprofit housing, the revival of the co-ops and other things like that. It's something that is, and I think it's the challenge for the young people going into planning now for this generation. There are two challenges. One of them is the affordability of our core cities, and the other one is the sustainability of our suburbs, put in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, you just put your finger on something that Sam Zell, that big real estate entrepreneur. I was at a meeting yesterday at the DePaul Real Estate Program, had their annual dinner, and he was the speaker. And he started out his speech by saying that he was selling short the suburbs, meaning he was selling his office space in the suburbs, and he's really into residential, and he can't sell apartment spaces in auto-centric areas. He said the young people, they don't even buy cars. They rent them by the hour if they ever need them, and they don't care what kind of car it is, like he did. He was talking about the 57 Chevy that he loved so much when he was in high school. They don't build their lives around cars. And so Vancouver's kind of the future there. And retrofitting suburbia, that's going to be a big task, because if the market doesn't like that, then it's going to have to change. It's not that people wouldn't want to live in a single family house with a garden, but they want to be able to walk and enjoy the social and shopping lifestyle that they can enjoy at a village main street or whatever. And you guys are all over that. You've already mostly got that stuff going in Vancouver.
Well, we have it going in our streetcar neighborhoods. We have it going in some of the older neighborhoods. Unfortunately, out at the edge of the city, just like in Calgary or Toronto or any other city in Canada, and I'm sure this is doubly true in North America, the old standards for suburban development, by the old, I mean the current standards for suburban development, are still being used. Suburbs are not designed, they are laid out. The streets are too wide, the properties are too big, the subdivision requirements are too grand, the zoning is exclusionary. So our problems out in our deep suburbs, frankly, is no different than your problem. Some people have even said, Vancouver is Paris in the middle, surrounded by Los Angeles at the outside. I don't like either of those things, because I actually like LA, but that's another issue. But the point is that we do have the challenge just as much as you do in America. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is where I kind of differ from a lot of my colleagues, I've come to this profound conclusion from working around the world that personal mobility is not on its way out. It's not a generational thing. There are some young people that at the moment, when they're young without families and kids, are not going for the car. But what I notice everywhere in the world is two things: that as incomes go up, personal mobility is one of the first luxuries that people seem to want, whether you're in Abu Dhabi or Chicago. And secondly, when you make that household choice and you get married and you have those kids, personal mobility becomes a lot more important. What I think we have to do is understand that if we can build many more choices for moving around into the urban system, including in the suburbs, then that choice of how to move around naturally will be one that you'll say, oh, okay, I'll use a car now, but on this trip I don't need the car, I don't want the car, or it's too expensive. For example, in my city, I would not think of going even to this meeting today or any other meeting in my car. It wouldn't make sense. I live downtown, and to use my car would be expensive, a pain in the neck, take too long. I just wouldn't do it. Or if you were in London, you wouldn't think of using your car. It's a pain in the neck. And we have to build the system so that the car's not out of it. People still want it occasionally. Some people really need it. But it's just not the best mode for many of the trips that we need to take. The suburbs to me are totally fascinating because I think the answer is staring us right in the face. Right in the face, all we have to do is look at it, first getting rid of all the standards, and then turn ourselves back to the streetcar suburbs of the 30s, where you will find the diversity, the densification, the walkability, the transit orientation, which, by the way, in those neighborhoods, the transit is paid for by consumers, and all the other things that we would want, including luxurious possibilities and very cheap possibilities. But the suburbs are illegal in North America right now. The streetcar suburbs are illegal in North America because of those contemporary standards. But if we go back and look at those streetcar suburbs and we apply that model out in the deep suburbs, we could have sustainable cities at all levels, not just in the cores, but out in suburbia, where still 60% of Canadians choose to live.
Yeah, I agree that some people will still want to live with a little more space, and we shouldn't we shouldn't try to make that illegal. But on the other hand, we need to remove the barriers that allow. If you look at the old streetcar suburbs in the U.S., unless there's some other factor weighing on it, they tend to perform better in the real estate market than the auto-oriented suburbs. So
what I love about the streetcar suburbs as an inspiration is that if you ask an average suburbanite way out in the deep suburbs to draw the kind of living environment they'd like, it's actually a streetcar suburb. It's not the one they live in, where it's just this, anonymous houses all the same and nothing else, and you can't get in. No, they talk about the city with diversity, and there's a shopping street, and there's all the things they need, and they can walk. That's what they'll draw. Well, we are not delivering it. Why? Because our laws don't allow it. And that's what I think has to change.
Well, you just pointed to something that when you're trying to get the right thing done in a community, the visual images you can put out there really, really have an impact. Tony Nelson from Rutgers, he's made a whole lifetime living out of that. He goes around from town to town. You show the urbanism versus the sprawl, and the public always picks the urbanism in various forms, but they always pick the urbanism. We always win the visual fights.
It's an interesting thing we're start talking about now is taking people from the very newest, most dispersed suburbs and taking them into the old streetcar suburbs and have them themselves audit those suburbs, measure it, walk it, count things, see what's going on, measure what they like, identify what they don't like. And then I'm confident they'll go, this is pretty good. And then say, okay, go back to your suburb, measure the same things, and start asking yourself, what could you change? Which streets could you narrow? Where could you add a little shopping thing? Where could you take a strip mall and turn it into a nice little alternative? Because there's a lot of possibilities there. Only 1% of the city gets built, in a year, and so we've got to really think about how we transform those existing suburbs. But it's not downtown.
One of the ways the argument happens, Dan Burden, the brother of a firefighter, the son of a firefighter, he's sort of the blue collar urbanist of all time. Anyway, Dan was helping out in helping the people in Hamburg, the little village south of Buffalo. And the state DOT wanted to take away the on-street parking and make it 2 lanes in each direction because it was a state highway. And it would have ruined the retail. And they fought and they fought. And finally, the New York DOT came around and backed off. And then eventually the New York DOT got an award for what was created there. And that's really how this fight is kind of in the suburbs, how it's manifesting itself. You have the traffic specialist who doesn't realize that these thoroughfares that go through the middle of these villages and towns are really important, special. They have a social purpose and an economic purpose that they have to recognize. And if they do, then the DOT will suddenly become beloved instead of hated. And I'm hoping they're starting to get that message. We have a long way to go, of course.
But
Um,
I will tell you this, that the transportation engineers and the transportation planners here in Vancouver are among the most informed, enlightened transportation planners I've ever seen in the world. Because once you, and I go back to the experience of downtown without freeways, once you see what the alternative could be as a transportation person, you really want to get behind that. So they have become the creative forces for cycling. They become the creative forces for walkability. All that energy of all those engineers can be motivated, can be directed towards the other city that we know we need to create.
that's right. And I'm a charter member of the Engineers Are Really Good People Deep Down Inside Club. And we did a partnership with the Institute of Transportation Engineers to create the Urban Walkable Street Guide that came out a few
Yeah.
years back. And now the Federal Highway Administration has endorsed it as an alternative to uh,
Area.
the
I
highway
heard most
lobby
of
was
that.
sabotage our program. But anyway, I was going to say something good about them, but now we don't have time. So anyway, Larry, I want to thank you very much, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. Maybe we'll do it on national television together.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Really worth hearing. I'm glad you've been our guest today, and we all look forward to visits to Vancouver to see the wonderful work you've done there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun. Real fun.
All right. Well, thank you, Larry. Thank you, John. Really appreciate you both coming on and talking about Vancouver. It was wonderful. I just want to let everyone know that we'll be back next month for another webinar. But before that, we have our Congress in Buffalo, June 4 through 7. Hope you'll join us then.
And you can watch it again online.
Yes, thanks. And we'll post this online in the next day or so. So thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.